As a reminder, please sign in on the attendees list. I'm going to remove the 7-2 meeting because it's still the first, unless anybody had a reason they wanted to capture something for that one. Give people 2 more minutes to show up. And feel free to add any agenda items that you want to talk about today also to the end of the agenda list. Right. Does anybody know if we're going to get Ben today? Ben or Emily? Should we just get started without him?
Emily, I think, is still working through internet.
Right.
Issues, from what she said in the leadership room.
Let's kick things off then. So first thing on the list is standing item, introductions and new faces. Do we have anybody? I think I see Josh Lewis. Do you want to introduce yourself? I don't think I've seen you in past meetings.
Yeah, I work on the same team as a lot of the other Heroku folks here with Joe and Terrence and Jesse. It's just been a few weeks. I've been here a couple times, but it's really been quite a while. Anyway, made time for it today.
Awesome.
Welcome back.
Good to see you. All right. I don't think we have any other new faces. So next thing on the list is release planning and updates. That's usually Emily and Javier. Javier, you want to take it?
Yes. So for Pack, we just went into feature complete, and that's releasing Pack 0.12.0 next Tuesday is kind of the goal. And yeah, I think that should be out there, willing to take anybody that could test it through their systems. But hopefully everything goes well.
Awesome. Any updates on lifecycle?
Trying to see if there's any contributors here that have been working with it closely. I don't think there's anything slated until after Pack releases, at least.
Sounds good. So the next thing on the list is reviewing outstanding RFCs. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll just go through them really quickly. I'm going to skip anything that's a draft or that is already on the list for today. So sorry, give me a second to figure out Zoom here. Everybody see that? Cool. So cache types and application mixins are both drafts, and we're talking about application mixins today. Inline build packs is on the list for today also. So next thing is read write platform volume mount. Is there any progress on this? What's the approval look like? Looks like it just needs a review from Terrence. Or is
Yeah,
there
I
any other,
know Ben reached out kind of looking for some feedback. I did post some feedback on there. I don't think I've gotten any reply to it. There is a separate RFC that I proposed and still in draft, which is cache types, that kind of answers to some of the primary goals of this one. But I do understand that this one is, maybe more encompassing. So I'm not entirely sure where to take it. Yeah, at least if it is approved, we could take it in. But otherwise, I think there's a conversation still being had.
Yeah, there was basically last Thursday, right, where we talked a bunch about that.
so it seems like still a lot of active discussion here. Maybe it's worth putting on the list for some week to keep talking about it.
Yeah, like at this point, I think there are philosophical differences in it. I'm half tempted just to call for a final vote and for a close with some disposition next week. I can't more strongly, sort of describe my belief that we should have a very, very flexible thing here. And alternatives are coming up, and this is just dragging on for weeks and weeks. So we'll just need to have an up-down vote on it.
Got it. Let's maybe be worth scheduling a impromptu SIG meeting for people who still have concerns to get one last chance to realize that we have conflicting opinions or whatever. I can organize that if I think it's a good idea. All right. Next thing, offline build packages. Dan is planning to present this next Wednesday, and he apologizes. He got pulled on to working on something else for an extra week or two, but should be able to pick it back up soon. I've been talking about it with him. I know that's one that we want to get through soon. Image pull policy, Javier. Any updates on this one?
I don't know what the status is, to be honest.
You updated the RFC, and I guess are waiting for reapprovals.
Yep.
Do I need to take people? Do I need to unapprove from some people? I'm not even on here.
So this, I'm sorry, I missed that had happened. So you were going to split out the default change and just make this about the flag. Is that basically what happened?
Yes, and adding a new pull policy, which is if not present.
Yeah. Okay. I can probably approve this right after the meeting. I just didn't realize I was waiting on.
Cool. Is this a platform specific one where only platform maintainers we're going to approve, or do other people need to approve as well, or do we need a core team vote?
Are we doing sub-team style RFC stuff today?
I don't know. In the past, we've talked about some RFCs could go to sub teams. I don't know if practically that's happened. Guess we'll assume it's core
Yeah, I
team.
think we should. Yeah, I think we should formalize that before we start running with it. But happy to try and formalize it. Yeah.
Next on the list, add RFC for stack metadata. I think I thought this was approved a while ago. Or something changed again. Okay, it looks like this needs more approvals.
Yeah, I guess the only question I had on it was the open question that I think Kevin put in the original RFC. Of just like, if you're putting stack stuff in the label and you rebase, does rebase now update the labels for you, or how does that work?
Rebase would rewrite the whole config blob to be whatever. It's just rebasing the FS layers that matter. And so changing labels on a rebase shouldn't be a problem, or there's no extra implication to that in terms of like having a consistent digest for some aspects of the image because the config blob is going to change anyways.
So is the expectation like that pack rebase would update the labels if they're there, since they're kind of spec'd out?
I'd expect the stack labels to move with the rebased base image.
Yeah, I believe the reason Kesha put this on there is just because to this point, Rebase hasn't changed any labels. It's just been an update to the underlying layers. And this would be the thing that made Rebase need to also change labels.
Worth calling out explicitly for sure. Seems like action here is drive the RFC to call that out specifically and then ask for approvals again.
Yeah. Other than that, like I think it's a good open question and seems good.
Root build packs. I think this is kind of on hold. Joe, did you want to?
Yep. No, just defer on that.
CA starts the draft. Exposing metadata. Any word from? I guess we don't have.
I talked to
here.
Paul, and he says he's looking at it now. He's coming back to it finally. I think he may talk about it next time he's here or next week.
Cool. And then app image extensions is superseded by application.
All of these other ones, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Anything else on RFCs? Unsharing my screen and moving back to the doc. Next thing on the list is RFC inline build packs. Joe, you want to take this?
Sure. I think there's just, I know Emily had feedback, but it was all pretty talked about that. The two things I think are outstanding on this are the use of the shell field. I don't know if maybe Emily had another comment on there.
I was going to talk to Emily at some point this week about why I think the shell field is important and that there's no good solution that involves a shebang instead of the shell field.
Cool. And then the other one was Terrence's comment about an inline table or an inline table, which when I started playing around with got pretty gross. So Terrence, you're going to have to fight me on that one if you still think that's important.
There's an inline table in TOML?
Or no, like inline as a table instead of a key, like a string. Can you see what's on the screen?
Is there an example in the thing?
Yes.
In the readable section, or
It's in the screen share if you're.
I don't have the screen share open. Sorry. Got it.
Terrence, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that. I get the value of it, but I don't like it.
Yeah, I mean, I also feel just like jamming a bunch of more things into build packs also feels pretty gross too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get it. I mean, that's why I spent the time playing around with it, is I felt there was value, but like this is going to be 90% of them. Like it's.
Yeah, you can also do the, I guess, like dot inline and then do equals and then kind of the curly braces as well.
Yeah, how would that work with like the multi-line, the here doc? I don't know if that, I'll have to play around with it.
Yeah, it may not work as well because of the multi-line, I think.
I like the word inline for the actual inline script definition. And like script seems generic. It could be inline or it could refer to a file in the app directory that's the inline build pack script, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if a way to solve this is pick another word for that top level thing and let inline versus script either supply, here's the inline definition, or point to a script. But then you could have that structure and it might be less confusing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's the structure I don't like, though. Like this is one of these things. In fact, I think it is the thing that I dislike about TOML is when you end up in this situation where you have a table inside of an array, and it's not. I think it's the thing that most people, when they encounter TOML, struggle with. So to make it this way for the sort of minimal case, I don't know. I would need some convincing.
Is there a reason you couldn't do buildpacks and then inline versus script on the inside of that? And then you could have API, inline, and script as different options. Just like get rid of the top level thing there, and then you don't need to replay it.
I didn't follow that.
So imagine you remove the second line of the snippet, right? So now you have in the buildpacks object, you have an API and a script, and then could you have an inline definition there and then vary on?
Oh, and then any other extra stuff would go in that table. Is that what you're saying?
Yep, adjacent to inline.
Yeah, that would, Terrence, address the concern of just jamming more stuff into buildpacks, but still make it pretty convenient for the base case.
Oh, I see. You're worried about polluting the namespace of buildpacks. That makes sense. Yeah, got it.
Well, that was my initial. It's not like a hard concern. Like I'm not going to die on this hill, but I guess I was just pointing out, like, I feel like this goes down a path of kind of like a lot of things in programming. Well, if you just add one more option, eventually you, like 2 years from now, it ends up being this like thing that has like 20 options on it, right?
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of just using the table for sort of enriching it, but putting, the script itself as just a top level thing.
Yeah, just like in the RC itself, it felt really gross when like you had to basically like clarify like, well, these things are optional and these things are required. And in this particular case, like you do this stuff.
Well, yes, agree. But we already do have a good bit of that with version URI. Like, I think the difference now is that it's not just version and URI and one other thing being mutually exclusive, but like a set of things being mutually exclusive from another set of things or something like that.
It's like a collected set, I guess.
You could just prefix. You could do inline and then inline dash API and then inline dash shell. It's a little gross, but.
Well, I'll play around with it some more. Come up with some other options, maybe. Yeah, but that's all there is for that one. Unless anybody else had something, anything else to talk about it.
I just threw a question on there specifically about the mechanics of how this will work in a build. Is the expectation that platforms like Pack would need to generate like a temporary ephemeral build pack and provide it to lifecycle? Or would the lifecycle have some Project TOML awareness in it?
So, right. So this would not be in the spec. This would be a platform feature of Pack. And the question about Buildpack TOML, I think, is a bigger question. And yeah, eventually I would like to have lifecycle have another binary or something that sort of pre-processes a project TOML. And this doesn't have to be a spec thing. It could just be a tool that comes with lifecycle that processes a project TOML and emits whatever the other phases of lifecycle need. So that might be machine readable JSON files. It might be a build pack on the file system. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think, like, if I was a platform, I would say either of Pack or KPack, how we'd actually implement this as spec today. And it seems like without the existence of a lifecycle prepare, we would actually read the project TOML and then construct ephemeral build pack on the fly.
Yeah, if you wanted to support it, that's what you'd have to do. I think another thing that's kind of brewing because of at Salesforce, we are using Project TOML is what does it mean to support part of Project TOML? Are we actually winning with Project TOML? I have a bunch of questions about that, and I'm hoping to bring those to a head sooner than later. Yeah, I don't actually have a good proposal yet, but I'm trying to come up with something that might lead to just better options for getting support into platforms without having to now I have to repeat everything that Pack's doing.
I like the idea of introducing that optional lifecycle binary. So like Pack might not use it because a lot of Project TOML is parsing, what not to upload into the container, right? Which can't be a lifecycle concern, but there are other parts of it that need to get processed into data that the lifecycle should parse to. It's a hard problem.
Yeah, potentially that could lead to splitting Project Toml out into like its own library, and Pack uses it for that optional binary, and Pack uses it, or Lifecycle uses it for the optional binary, and Pack uses it for whatever it does.
Yeah.
Might help with that.
Cool. Anything else on inline build packs? Going once, going twice. Moving on to application mixins.
Yeah, so I'm just about ready to open this as a real PR. It's in draft state right now. But I think I've wrapped up all the loose ends from the conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks. So just to go over what I captured from last time, one of the questions was how to specify this in the builder toml or an order. So I've introduced stack.buildpacks. There's no order, they're just all run until you meet the project's mixin requirements. That's the proposal, happy to go back and forth on it. I removed the mixin type thing and just went with the pattern that Stephen had proposed. And I did keep a type in the plan for provides and requires. Again, happy to go back and forth on this, but something about the implicit, like a regular build pack always requires and a stack pack always provides, just didn't sit super well with me. So I was trying to think of alternatives for that. Yeah, we can discuss that. I know we weren't happy with privileged as a key that, as a way of indicating or distinguishing a build pack from a stack pack, but I didn't come up with anything better. So would love suggestions there. I added somewhere in here that stack packs must ensure ABI compatibility, and that rebase, yeah, will continue to work. So there's no like pack upgrade or anything like that. The caching I borrowed from one of the earlier RFCs. So I've introduced excludes into the launch toml. You can define a bunch of paths as being excluded from the image, but still cached or not cached. I had a little discomfort with a stack pack that executes on the build image writing a launch toml, but I can still think of a case for process types from a stack pack, so it's kind of interesting. Yeah, happy to discuss that. And then the last one was, bin detect. I think it should have access to the application source code read-only, which would make bin detect dynamic, which means I don't think we should have a like static detect result.
Doesn't that break rebase though?
No, because you don't run detect on rebase. Or I mean, like you wouldn't, like what, I'm not sure how that would break rebase, I guess.
You'd assume that the initial invocation of detect's output against, you'd have to like store the initial output of detect from the build somewhere and then replay that on rebase, making the assumption that the application directory didn't change. I think that works.
No, I don't think I'm not sure I follow that. Like, why would you run? I thought we established that you don't need to run the stack packs on rebase because they'll ensure ABI compatibility unless
you still have to run build on rebase, right, in order to replay the changes on top of it. The ABI compatibility isn't
okay. No,
directory structure. So, sorry.
Yeah, no, I misunderstood that. I thought we were saying that you as a stack pack author must ensure that a rebase will still work. And if that's not the case, then that changes us a little bit, but that's fine.
So ABI compatibility just means that dynamic libraries aren't going to get swapped and changed. It doesn't mean that a file can't run a file, which is a different thing.
No, you're right. I'm sort of abusing the term, but no, yeah, I thought we were saying that that the file system, whatever changes that stack pack made would accommodate, or you're just accepting that you're not going to get it to rerun. But if that's not the case, that's fine, because I actually had it that way originally. If that's the case, I think we should, like you were sort of starting to describe, store the output of bin detect and just pass it into build, or do what you need to do so that you don't run detect.
Got it. That sounds good. There was an issue that without, for a stack image that has a stack pack that can dynamically provide mixins at build, it becomes impossible to select build packs statically. I think McNeil, you brought this up, that might be usable on the base image or not, or there's no way of predicting that unless we like expose some metadata that says, hey, this has a stack pack that can provide mixins. You're not allowed to do static validation.
I didn't follow that. Can you say it again?
Yeah, so right now you can make a build package that has metadata on it that says this build package can only be used on base images with these mixins. And we use this a lot on the VMware side. If stack packs can dynamically say what mixins they provide at build time, you can no longer do that static validation to match build packages with the correct stack images. You have to try a build and see if it fails. So we need in the case that the stack has stack packs, you'd need to put some metadata on it that says, hey, this has a stack pack and all bets are off with mixin validation. You should be allowed to, put, you kind of get the problem.
Yeah, I do now. Does that mean it's limited? Like, can it provide, this is the subset of mixins I provide, but it could potentially provide more than that?
That could be a solution. Or, well, if it can provide more than that, if a stack pack, if there's like a static list initially, and then it can add to the static list, then you still couldn't do static validation because you wouldn't allow any, build package that's set up front. These are the mixins I need. You'd have to allow that to be used with the stack. But you could provide less. You could have it say, these are all the things this is the range of things I can provide, and then it provides more specific list during detect. That would be okay.
Yeah, I think we had a conversation about providing some form of wildcard support.
Yeah, I just posted in the chat a link to what I think is like a Gherkin form of the expectation that I think the platforms would be expecting.
Oh, and the, where's that?
So it's in Slack. Ultimately, I could just copy and paste the whole thing.
My browser's not authenticated with Slack right now, so I can't see it.
Zoom chat, if you have it open.
There you go, Zoom chat. I just posted the whole wording. It looks nicer in Slack.
What's the use case for the stack pack being able to express the requirements the stack pack being able to see the app directory during detect?
I don't have a specific use case. I thought it would be a capability that would be valuable. I'm happy to think through it a little bit more to see if it really is. I think part of it is also if we do eventually have a real root build pack kind of concept that is a little bit more, powerful and maybe forces you to give up some things. I would like it to work the same way. Where like a root build pack is just a build pack that runs on your app code, and you would expect bin detect to have access to your app code. I think the question here, having access to the app code, I don't think is terribly controversial. It's whether the bin detect the mix. It's not even bin detect. It's really the mixins it provides. Do they need to be dynamic or not? And if it's just static mixins, like maybe bin detect isn't even the right place for that. Like maybe we should just get mixins out of the build plan and put it into the Buildpack TOML, like I know has been suggested.
I mean, I think it is dynamic without the stack pack having been detect, because the requesting build packs can dynamically decide what build packs they need, right? And then those get sent to it without needing the bin detect of the stack pack to be dynamic, because the list of mixins that gets installed is actually, in the apt build pack case, is actually coming from the other build packs that do get to dynamically decide what they need. It's just the constraint, the like, what are all the things that I could provide that gets output during bin detect of the stack pack, and it's whether that needs to be dynamic or not that I'm curious about. I don't see I don't have a strong opinion of whether it is. I think we can handle it one way or the other, but I'm trying to understand what the motivations would be for making it dynamic, given that it's just outputting the range of things, and you still have the other build packs dynamically saying what mixins they need. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not like trying to pull it one way or the other. I'm just trying to understand what makes the most sense for the problem we have.
So are you suggesting that the build packs list them statically ahead of time, or?
I think I could see two implementations. One where, like, in build pack TOML of the stack pack, it says, this is what I can contribute in terms of mixins, right? That, like, what the app build pack there would be with that regex, right? And then the other build packs, detect scripts, can output mixin requirements that then get fed to that build pack and are passed through that filter, right, automatically. And that filter, being a static thing, would let you do pre-validation. They're like, oh yeah, this can supply anything. I can put whatever build packages on it I want, or not. It has that benefit if it's static. If it's not static and bin detect can output it, then it seems like the app build pack would always output the same thing anyways, right? Yes, I can provide whatever. Or like, I can't think of a situation where you'd make a stack pack that dynamically determines the filter. Does that make sense? But there could be, and I think that's a good reason to figure out another solution to the static problem if we have that problem. But that's the part that I'm like curious about.
Is that strictly a performance thing where you don't want to have to go through every stack and run the text so you can match a build pack? Like that would just be that'd be terrible. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
McNew, do you want
I don't know if it's probably performance, because I imagine the detects would happen very quickly. It just seems like stack packs are trying to solve a very thin use case. And it might actually simplify the creation of them if they're just statically defined what they can provide. Additionally, it helps with that problem I think we talked about a little bit ago, which is if stack packs statically describe what they can provide, we can figure out ahead of time, so there's ever a chance a build would ever successfully execute with the build pack, to like give the user some heads up before executing the build.
Mm-hmm.
So a good example could be in pack, if you create a builder, right? If I'm not mistaken, we would go through the create builder process, and you could potentially create a builder that doesn't work together the way that you expect it to, because you don't know that there would be no way to know that the stack pack doesn't necessarily actually work with any or this build pack, right? That you're also bundling in this builder.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that feels pretty important, that you can create a builder that is basically broken.
And you wouldn't find out until every single build of it always fails.
Yeah, well, okay, so I think I'm pretty convinced that like we need the static mixins, probably in Buildpack TOML. The question then is if we need bin detect at all. Like I almost feel like we should do nothing with it so that we could potentially reserve it for in the future if we decide, oh, there is this case where you want to dynamically just provide a regular provides, or we do want to introduce mixins provide mixins into the build plan.
Yeah, see, the way I thought I understood this was like the pattern for the build pack TOML works so that we know what build packs are compatible with the stack
Mhm.
pack. But then the detect phase, the way it provides mixins is maybe not so much by patterns, but very specific mixins that then says, oh, the app needed this one. So yes, I'm able to provide that one. And that would be essentially a subset
Yeah.
of what the static pattern was.
Yeah, that's actually the way I thought about it at first too, but I don't know if bin detect can do that without the processed build plan. Or I guess, I mean, yeah, well, like what's it going to do? Is it just going to, it's going to be like, lifecycle will be like, here's the mixins I need. And it will be like, okay, I will give you those mixins. Like, I don't know if that'd ever be any different just by the build plan. You would have to look at the app. And that, even though I just don't have a use case for it yet, I just something I feel would be expected and potentially useful.
I mean, the dynamic part is the other build packs, figuring out what
Yeah.
mixins they need, right? And then you could have nothing for the stack packs for detect, just not implement detect for stack packs, and then always feed those mixins through and fail milliseconds later in the build, during the build phase, when the stack pack says, oh, I can't provide those mixins, right? Or you could have a static declaration up front on the part of the stack pack that says, this is the range of mixins I have, right? That you could pre-validate even before detection if it's truly static, right? Or you could have something in the middle where during detect it outputs the mixins, like filter of mixins that it's allowed to implement, so we could fail during the detect phase. And the thing in the middle, it's hard to understand the motivation for that versus one of the two other sides, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying that detect would like look at the mixins that are required and then compare that to some package repository index and say, oh, yep, I've got those. I can install those. Is that kind of what you're suggesting it would do?
Detect is always in parallel, right? Like build packs don't know about each other during the detect phase, so it can't get the mixins during detect and then read them and then.
Oh yeah, I guess I was thinking like the app mixins.
That makes sense. But, yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
The dynamic mixins coming from the other packages that the base image doesn't provide, right? Like if you're going to send it to it during detect, you might as well just send it to it during build, because at that point, you've already, you're not running the detect process, right. Serialized thing.
Would it ever be useful for detect's only purpose just to fail if it's unable to actually do what it claims it can? It's purely like a fail, non-fail case.
I can see that. You could just do both, right? You could have static mixins and build pack TOML, for instance, and then detect could further constrain that based on the environment and app directory. That would work too. I'm curious for the need to output a dynamic filter, though. That's what I don't understand as much. I'm not opposed to it. I just want to understand it better.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm saying I'm convinced of that too. What about so I can work through that. What about the privileged thing? Oh, by the way, non-item potent is used in an HTTP spec RFC, so deal with it. I'm happy to change that, but I've got nothing. The privileged, I can't remember your reasoning for not liking that. I think it had to do with the fact that it doesn't do like what you would expect from Docker, like if you patch -- privileged or something like that. So it might just be the wrong or misleading or something like that. But we need something to distinguish a stack pack or potentially just a generic root build pack from a normal build pack.
Privilege sounds right for root build packs. Or like that seems like it's a really good way to describe that, really technically accurate way to describe that, and what other people use but we have to distinguish a stack pack from a root build pack also, right?
Do we? I don't know if we do. Like you could potentially use a root build pack as a stack pack and it might not do what you expected it to do. Like maybe it just doesn't provide any mix-ins. That doesn't mean you can't use it as a stack pack.
I think if you can provide more information about what that could look like, then I'd be more comfortable with it.
About what could look like?
About what it would look like for a root build pack to be used as a stack pack. Or it seems like it's like a confusing pre-optimization.
The case that I was thinking of was like, well, I guess you'd still, I don't know, all the cases that quickly came to mind, you'd still probably provide a mix-in, even if it was just like set equals or something. Yeah, I'm sorry. Finish your thought.
No, I think I see what you're saying. You're saying like you're trying to make it so that the stack pack interface matches the root build pack interface, and that the context for which the root build pack is used determines whether someone's making the commitment that it follows the AVI compatibility constraints and can be used in a rebasable way with the stack pack, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so privileged would be the way you indicate it as a root build pack, and then deciding where you use it is how you indicate it as a stack pack. That makes sense. I'm just, if you could put that in the RFC, and then, like,
well,
I worry in the end.
No. Actually, if we're doing the static mix-in thing, the combination of privileged and mix-ins would identify it as a stack pack more narrowly.
But that's not, the mix-in thing isn't determinable until detect. I think it depends on what we do with detect, right? If detect looks like different than root build packs, then it's a different thing. If detect looks just like root build packs, then it's probably the same thing in contextual.
Can we maybe be more specific or explicit with the types? I think we mentioned it earlier. We already have two different types, which is the standard concrete build pack and the order build pack. And now we're going to introduce the stack build pack. So instead of, assuming based on the information that you input, we could use something like a type field that's very explicit to say what it should be, and then could maybe potentially even give more guidance that way.
That was a suggestion from last week, right?
Maybe.
I think, Joe, maybe you're trying to avoid too many types, or you're trying to say like we don't have two extra types. There's just really one extra type, and there's a way you can use it that implies more compatibility. Is that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's exactly it. Like, I'm hoping, and I could be wrong just in the way I'm seeing into the future, but like I was hoping that if we had a type field, it would not be type equals stack, that it would be type equals root. You know what I mean? And I could be wrong about that goal, but yeah.
Can we defer the decision about how we type it until we get the rest of stack pack developed, so we can see like, does this look like a root build pack, and then either make it look like a root build pack and use privilege true, or decide it's actually needs some other field?
Yeah, it seems like we could do that. I mean, I don't think we'd have like, it's not like we'd have to rewrite the whole guts of it just because that configuration thing changed.
Yeah, I think I would be happy to go with privilege true if what we end up with looks like it's applicable in there, but it seems like the other questions we talked about earlier matter too much for me to be able to make a decision on that, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Is there a case where idempotent is true, or not idempotent is true, but privilege is false?
Oh yeah, I was wondering about that too.
This reminds me of like when we did the KubeCon one year, where we talked about those like cache flags from back in the day.
And we made the matrix.
I'm having like nightmares thinking about like these flags right now. I'm just like,
no, I think that's, yeah. So imagine there's no privileged. It's just defaults to false, and then idempotent, non-idempotent is true. I think that's like, I think that means don't give me my run image layers and all that stuff. Maybe the cache too.
Yeah, I guess part of it's just like, I would like to see in this RC if we go down this path of like actually walking through that table of that matrix, because I feel like that's what we had to do for cache to some degree.
Mhm.
Of like, what's this use case? What does that look like? If we can't enumerate those, then maybe these aren't the right flags.
Idempotent equals false or equals true without privilege equals true. I don't even know if that has very much meaning, right? It would be like, don't recover cache layers, a cache busting build pack or something.
Yeah, which is like, well, why did you cache stuff?
Yeah.
Well, I guess no, because it could. You could contribute something to the run image or the launch image that you don't want to get back, right? But I guess you could just like blow it away. It would be like it'd be a way to like not put that RMRF line in your build pack or something.
I think that build packs explicitly turning on layers when they want to keep them, right? That .toml.cache thing that was proposed, that interplays with that a lot, or it would make that idempotent flag less useful or less meaningful because the default is nothing gets recovered until a build pack explicitly opts into it. So that's an interplay. I got to drop off a little bit early, but I had one question around CA certs. So we said this model works really well for CA certs, but we haven't talked about that in the context of mix-ins because I feel like they're not mix-ins, right? So you kind of stack pack that guarantees the rebasability in that guarantees the ABI compatibility, right? And would reapply like when the upstream CA certs change because one of them is removed because it's no longer trusted because they got hacked or whatever, and you don't want to lose that removal, right? That seems like a really good use for stack packs and CA certs. But if they're tied into the mixins API, like, is there a workflow where you have a stack pack specified? It says, no, I don't provide any mixins, but it still runs every time, right? Or should CA certs, should we define this by saying the Bionic stack defines a special new, thing like set equals that's like cert equals, right? Or something that means I provide some CA certs or I require some CA certs. But it doesn't even need to be dynamic, right? It really doesn't have a require. So that's also confusing.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say you just want something that runs all the time.
A way to think about that maybe in this context is maybe this is the thing that drives out having separate requires and provides for the stack pack as part of the build plan, because then the stack pack could require and provide a mix-in. And then that's how you achieve, yes, it runs every time. And then that drives out the other change you mentioned, which is like maybe instead of mix-ins with type requires and type provides, it really is just fits into the normal build plan as a requires on the other end, and there's a key under it that's like mix-in equal true, right? Then it looks a lot more like the other build packs too, which seems like a plus. I don't know, that would be one way to solve it that kind of goes towards your goal of making it feel more like build packs.
Yeah, I guess that does mean you have to run the bin detects of all the stack packs every time, even if there's no missing mix-ins, right? Because they could provide and require their own.
Sorry, they could still be static, right?
No, okay.
If there's,
sorry, go ahead.
If they're still static, would they just not run if they don't have a detect? Or are you saying that build packs would just indicate they know how to handle CA certs and we'd skip even their detect?
Not sure I understood, sorry.
A build pack that provided a CA cert, would it never run detect and just indicate that it knew how to handle CA certs essentially?
A stack pack that provided a CA cert,
stack pack.
Would it no longer run detect? It's like, imagine, I'm not saying we should do this, but imagine that the build plan contributions from stack packs are static and defined in build pack toml, right? To do CA certs, you do something like require, mix-in equals true, name equals, you'd say cert equals yes as the mix-in name using that set equals notation, right? And then you could also control like build and run to determine where you want them. And then you'd also say provides mix-in equals true, name equals cert equals yes, and then something like that. You do maybe not yes there, maybe the name of the certificate that this CA cert installing Stack Pack is going to provide, right? Or my company's CA certs, something like that. And then because they're matched up, they're statically defined initially in the build plan format. It doesn't need to be resolved by another build pack, and always happens and fits into the thing. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I was just trying to understand like how you know when to execute the CA cert stack pack. And if that was the case, the CA cert stack pack would just always execute, even
Right.
in build. And in the case that no CA cert is actually provided, it's just a no op.
Right.
That'd work. It might be expensive because CA certs are the stack packs are fundamentally running in a different running as root, executed by lifecycle. So on some subplatforms, that might be its own container.
Stack packs are always run per build though, right?
Yeah, it's just there is a cost there. Probably more than just a regular build pack. Per build.
If a platform wanted to implement it not per build, it should probably just extend the stack image though, right?
Yeah.
Or use a different strategy for CA certs, like in containers.
Yeah, I'm approaching this all on a pure build basis. I know we've discussed non-per build as well, but it seems like we at least need to support per build.
Yeah. Joe, is this helpful feedback for you?
Yeah.
Cool. I gotta drop off a little early. Thanks, everybody. Someone else can pick up if there are more things.
Thanks.
I removed my item just based on the time allocated to it.
What was the item?
It was the cache types. So that's a draft PR, but I know that there were some discussions that probably wanted to be had in relation to the volumes, but we could do that tomorrow.
Sounds good. Ben won't be here tomorrow, right?
I wasn't aware of that, but I think nonetheless, some of the things that I want to add probably to the volume, which is what he's proposing, is at minimum and for it to be behind experimental, which I think has already been discussed. And if that is the case, then I think that should be acceptable. But I do agree with him that they are solving, or speaking to two different personas.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about it tomorrow, and then
Cool.
we can follow up with Ben if there's other stuff. Cool. Well,
Alrighty.
sounds like that's it for today. So see everyone tomorrow who's coming tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.